What's up, everybody? So recently I've been reading Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. Let's talk about it. So in this discussion, I'm going to cover the first 6 chapters of this book. And if you're wondering which edition this is the 1968 effed up edition. The first time I sat down to read this book, both the front and back cover just detached. So before I get into the actual content of this book, I want to talk about the interesting origins of this story. So this book, in part, was born out of a 1958 moratorium on nuclear weapons testing by the Eisenhower administration. And there was an interesting article that Robert Heinlein wrote in the newspaper in April of 1958 in response to another article that was discussing the benefits of banning and putting a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. The group that originally had written the article was the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. And so in April of 1958, in response to this article, Robert Heinlein writes his own article in disagreement with this, advocating the continuation of nuclear weapons testing. And the headline of Heinlein's article is titled, "Who are the heirs of Patrick Henry? Stand up and be counted." And in this article, it is interesting some of the comments that he makes. So for instance, there's a lot of accusations of communism. It does seem to be an element of slander in this article. There's also an element of the Red Scare and McCarthyism in it. And this article really invokes the spirit of the Revolutionary War, hence the reference to Patrick Henry. He even has other quotes from well-known figures from the Revolutionary War. And there are a few interesting quotes from the article that give insight into Starship Troopers. In one quote he says, "But not peace at any price, not the price of liberty." And what he means here is liberty or death. He's not going to submit to enslavement under a communist system. Otherwise he would rather die. Those who signed off on this manifesto from the National Committee on a Sane Nuclear Policy, he says, about them, consciously or unconsciously, they prefer enslavement to death. October 1958, there was a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. And at the end of 1959, about a year later, Starship Troopers is released. Robert Heinlein talks about this in his book, The Expanded Universe. There are essays in there that discuss this. But now on to Starship Troopers. And this book is set far in the future. The first chapter describes a mission involving the main character, Johnny Rico, and they're going into a drop. We get the first introduction to this mechanized armor that augments the soldier in the mobile infantry, the MI they call it. And they're basically bouncing around in this armor through this city, causing as much destruction and havoc as possible. They're trying to disorient the enemy, and then they meet at the drop zone, and then they're extracted. And that's sort of the first chapter. And then in the second chapter, we see Johnny Rico in his civilian life before he's joined up. So there's a jump back in the past. So at first, Rico doesn't care about the military. In fact, he's not intent on joining it. He only joins it because of his friend Carl. And they're tight-knit and they're best friends. And I also want to point out that Rico's wealthy. And his friend Carl isn't as well off. So it does make sense that joining the military, it likely provides more benefits. So there's a scene right at the beginning where Carl tells Johnny that he's going to join the military. And then Johnny tells his father that he's going to join. And his father's immediate reaction is to blame Mr. Dubois, the history and moral philosophy teacher. And I just kept thinking, like, of course that would be his reaction. Like, you have this class that's kind of borderline propaganda, and you would immediately believe or be convinced that that was the reason for him wanting to join. But Rico is like, no, we all hate Mr. Dubois. And you get the sense that the reason they don't like Dubois is just more because he's a realist. He kind of tells them that they're probably not soldier material. And I can't tell if the father, represents society at large or just like the wealthy appendage of society. But he goes on this little rant about how the military service and joining up doesn't provide any benefits. And the father also discusses how there's basically world peace. The military is obsolete and it's just a drain on taxpayer funds. So it feels like there's this collective belief where they're forgetting why this tradition of military service for franchisement and elected officials is so important in this story. And then there's this moment where his father tells him, well, I'm going to send you to Mars and you're going to have a great fun trip and just forget all about military service. Johnny at first is like, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm going to do that. He's cool with it. Heinlein's trying to give the main protagonist, Johnny, this sense of, I guess, nebulous notions of politics and civil and military service. It's just sort of background noise to him. He's more fixated on hanging out with Carl and looking at women. But when I read that personally, I'm somewhat suspicious, given that there's an entire class espousing a very specific worldview. And I just feel like in our world, if we had classes like this, we would consider them heavy-handed. And we would wonder what beliefs they were imparting. Johnny is with Carl, and Carl's going to join up, and he's accompanied. And then they run into Carmen, and she's joining up. So Johnny is just like, I am too. He's just trying to fit in. That's all he's trying to do. So even with this heavy-handed class, he still is only joining to be cool. So Johnny and Carl go to join up, and they talk to this recruiter. And he basically tries to talk them out of it. This is a voluntary decision. And military service is perilous and dangerous. And he knows most people are just doing this so they can become full citizens. They still agree to join, and the recruiter sends them to get their physical. So when Johnny's talking to the doctor warns him about joining up. And the doctor says that military service is for ants. And he says it doesn't confer any benefits, and he sees them leave, he sees them come back, if they even do come back. And this is all on page 29 of the 1968 effed up edition. Then he says, even though they have this right to vote, they're not any more competent to use it anyhow. It seems as if the doctor sees the military as something of a farce. They give you stupid jobs, and they give them to stupid people who aren't worthy, and then they just have the right to vote, and they have the right to run for elected office. I think the point is that the military isn't just giving them stupid jobs for the sake of stupid jobs. They're doing it because these are real tests, and they need to perform these dangerous tests in order to advance their military knowledge, to press their military advantage into the future. In the same way that Heinlein thought that continuing nuclear tests, even though there's risk, is important because it keeps that military advantage. Back to the impetus for writing this book. It keeps us from falling under the rule, in Heinlein's belief, of communist enslavement. And there's some cool things. We learned that there are talking canines called Calebs who can communicate with their human trainers. And there is a sense that the military is completely voluntary. And it's not really meant to be punitive. So even if you join up and take the oath and you just never return, they don't really care. You just can't become a full citizen. You don't get a second chance. And I think the point Heinlein is trying to make is that it's not punitive. It's just a cultural tradition that protects society. And there's this interesting, what I would call, transformation that occurs on page 31. So right after he's joined up, and he has this sense, this realization that he's no longer a civilian. He doesn't know what he is. And as he says, I didn't know yet what I was, but I knew what I wasn't. So he's here in this moment in a state of undefined potential. And throughout, there's this unspoken assumption that through military service, you will maximize your potential because the suffering and the struggle imparts special knowledge and understanding. So at the end of chapter 2, he gets put into the mobile infantry. And chapter 3 is his time spent in boot camp. And some of the boot camp stuff was really fun to read. And one thing I want to point out is on page 44, as he's in boot camp, still in chapter 3, he has this realization about sleeping. And I think this is part of his transformation. It's sort of simple and it's very physical. He stumbles on this realization of a privilege he didn't realize he had before. The ability to just go to sleep peacefully and comfortably. This is something he's just taken for granted. So a little while later, Johnny is working with Captain Frankel, and Sergeant Zim comes in with Ted Hendricks. And Ted Hendricks has punched Zim in the face. And he gets lashes for it, and then he gets discharged from military service. And suddenly he doesn't want to be here anymore. The reason is because he realizes it could be him. He doesn't want to make that same mistake. And so he vows to leave the military service. And one of the things that prevents this is he gets a letter from Mr. Dubois, his history and moral philosophy teacher. In it, he congratulates him on making it over this slump, or the hump, as he calls it, where you're past the physical hardship. And then he discusses this transformation. But here we get just an obvious reference to it on page 73 in Mr. Dubois' letter. He says, "It's not the hardest physically, though physical hardship will never trouble you again. You now have its measure. But the hardest spiritually, the deep soul-turning readjustments and reevaluations necessary to metamorphose a potential citizen into one in being." The physical transformation, though, here was crucial because there's a certain special knowledge, a deep understanding that is only imparted through struggling and suffering. But this physical transformation is really just a precursor to the most important transformation. As Mr. Dubois calls it, a spiritual transformation. And this is on page 74. Mr. Dubois says, "The noblest fate that a man can endure is to place his own mortal body between his loved home and the war's desolation." Now that you've gone through this physical transformation, now these words that I'm saying to you make sense. Because now you've been primed and conditioned for this new knowledge. These ideas that Dubois was trying to convey in class weren't comprehensible until you've been through this very specific lived experience. So in other words, Johnny had to suffer and struggle in order to understand the privileges that he has had access to his entire life. He was not valuing them correctly. And what it all comes down to is something that Dubois discussed on page 24 in class. Violence is of paramount importance in order to protect freedom and society, right? And I think that's what it means in this story to be a citizen, to have full citizenship. It doesn't mean the law just okayed your right to vote and hold office. It's a deeper personal understanding. People who have been through the gauntlet, who have undergone this spiritual transformation and this physical transformation, have this cool-headed, stoic understanding. And that is what it means to be a citizen in this story. And this accords too with the quote at the beginning of chapter 6 about not valuing freedom too lightly. These people who have had these transformations don't treat freedom flippantly or irreverently. In other words, they ennoble it to its correct value. And this also goes back to the article that Heinlein wrote, where he talks about how it's better to give your life than to live a life of peace under communist enslavement. And this is also exactly what Dubois talks about on page 75 when Johnny remembers one of his lectures. The value of freedom and protecting society and those who live in that society. The cost of that is to give your life. And what you gain is the best thing possible, a free society. Now, it's possible that I am wrong in kind of my assessment of all this, because if you think back to the letter, Eisenhower was in the military and he still put the moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. The other point is that the people who wrote the original article that provoked Heinlein's response weren't necessarily voting, right? So even in this society, there's free speech. So these people still could have banded together to write a very cogent and persuasive argument for instance, banning nuclear weapons testing. And no vote was really required. They could have just persuaded and convinced people who did have the right to vote. So ultimately, it doesn't really rule that out. So it's very possible I'm wrong about all this. I don't know. Anyway, this is a long ass video already. As always, thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next video. Peace.